reason I don't have a mic is our speaker tonight doesn't like mics. He said everybody can hear him. We're all going that route. Before we get started, I'd like to take a couple minutes to think about Alice Weiss Button. She was one of our original directors and one of the pushers for a historical society in Bethany. She served as town clerk, treasurer, secretary to the first selectman, which is probably one of the biggest jobs in town. But Alice was a real buff as far as history went. Anybody that has anything to do with cemeteries in town will realize that Alice did a lot. Board and so forth, who was buried there. She also knew everybody, who they married, when they married, and so forth. She's a big loss to us. So I'd like to take a minute of silence for Alice Weiss. Alice, we're going to miss you. Thank you. Bob?
That's the introduction. It's a little difficult tonight, I guess, for all of us. Most of us have just come from Seymour. And as Timer said, Alice will be greatly missed. Her daughter mentioned tonight that she would have wanted us to go on with this because she was so devoted to the history of history. And I think we all know. Tonight's talk is called A Century of Images. One of the dangers of making up the title before you make up the talk is there sometimes is not an exact match between what you do and what you say. I had hoped to get 100 slides that would show 100 years. I'm just not that good. I started off with about 400 and I got down to 130. For those of you who are counting and looking at the clock, just so you'll know where we stand. The format tonight is I'm going to show you 20 slides that tell something about what life was like in the first decade of this century, 1900 to 1910. And you're going to find that probably many of the images you see could have been 25, 50, or 100 years before that and would not have been much different. I'm going to show 10 slides from each decade after that, and then more slides of the last decade. I don't know if it's more important or I just have more slides of it, but I'm going to let you make that decision. One apology I'm going to make. We always have to apologize sometimes, and my apology is that this is my talk, and therefore I got to select the images that I thought were important. Furthermore, I'm going to apologize to those people who I don't acknowledge. I'm not going to remember everybody that gave us every slide, but these historic slides are the result of donations by many of you in this room, where you either gave us slides or you loaned us photographs that we made slides from. Some of these you may have seen in other contexts. Tonight the idea is to kind of develop a theme using these images that, again, I apologize, they're my selection. Can we have the lights? That's vodka. This is the I got it. I'm going to start off with a slide that was made possible by someone sitting in the front row. It was taken by Fred Cunningham in 1948, am I correct? In the Packard Field. I start off with this simply because it's a scene in the mid-century. You know, half of the century had passed by this time. Half of the century was yet to come. And it's just a beautiful photograph to start with. So I make no apology for this. Nelson Peck's orchard. Okay, now we're going to go back in time. Again, you may have seen this before in some past talk. This is what Bethany looked like, a very sleepy town, but very much like it is today in the center. These buildings still remain, part of the church shed remains. There are two themes that you may see, or you may be able to follow tonight. There may be other themes too that are unstated. But I think one of the themes is change. And the other one is preservation of values, traditional values. So if you kind of look for these two things as we go along. Certainly Bethany at the turn of the century, 1900 to 1910, was very different than Bethany today in many ways. One of the most obvious is that as we go along, you're going to see that areas that are now heavily wooded in those days were quite open. It was an agricultural community. It was a farming community. Why is this here? This is just kind of a reminder that as early as 1905, we had the first history of Bethany written by Eliza J. Hines. Bethany and its Hills, very rare book today. It actually has been republished. But as early as 1905, people were writing about the beauty of Bethany's Hills, hence the name. This is kind of traditional farming techniques that would have been found in Bethany in that first decade of the century. You would find century before that, 2 centuries before that, maybe 500 years before that, maybe not in America, but you would find farming methods were not very much different. However, with the industrialization of the late 19th, early 20th century, people began to become more mechanized in their agricultural pursuits in Bethany. I just particularly like this one, which was taken down on Litchfield Turnpike across from Bethway Road. And it's pretty obvious to me that this family was very, very proud of their equipment. I mean, they posed the mowing machine, the dump cart, the horses. There's a frame for the loose hay. Even the boys with the hand rakes to get that last little bit of hay. I think that's a dump rake. It's hard to tell from here. Or no, it's a tether, I guess. But anyway, they're very, very proud of the results of the industrialization. Here's a ground-driven mowing machine. These are all Bethany photographs, by the way. In the interest of saving time, which many of you mentioned to me on the way in, coincidentally, I don't know if it's a conspiracy, I won't give you too much information except that this is what they call a dump rig. This was taken on Downs Road. Again, you look at the mountains in the background and they're just not as wooded as they are today. This was taken on the Carrington farm. Very typical of how you get your hay in to store in the barn for the winter. Again, a Carrington photograph. I put it here just to show you the kind of transportation, the kind of roads that were in existence in that first decade of the century. Is this exactly 1900 to 1910? I'm not sure, but it certainly is representative of what you would expect to see. You'll notice they were very dressed up. A trip to the city, like Seymour, was a major event. New Haven was a major event. You didn't go there for a newspaper and come back. That didn't happen. What you did was, you planned your day around it. You did your marketing. You did your trading. you brought your goods in to sell. In the wintertime, again, this was taken on Downs Road on the Doolittle Farm. This is how you got around in the wintertime, with a horse and sleigh. I never really had much experience in this, but everyone that I've ever spoken to who's had a lot of first-hand experience with it agrees that it was a pretty uncomfortable mode of transportation. Again, you'll notice West Rock in the background doesn't look like it does today. This period was kind of the end of the use of muscular power for transportation, either walking, riding a horse, horse and carriage, wagon, buggy, ox cart. I thought I'd throw this in here because it's one of the last horse barns that I know of that was built in Bethany. There may have been others built afterwards just for horses for transportation and draft purposes. This is Alice Whitting's barn being built. It looks pretty much like that today, same cupola. And they look pretty proud of their handiwork, don't they? The gentleman in the straw hat is Wilbur Lounsbury. Changes are starting to take place technologically in addition to mowing machines and things like that. Transportation is a major change. At the turn of the century, people started to come out for pleasure purposes on weekends. They had more time available. These are often people that lived in the city, and they didn't have to milk cows 7 days a week. They had Sunday off, or maybe if they're really lucky, they had Saturday or part of a Saturday off. And they could come out Litchfield Turnpike to this Wheelman's Rest, which stood on the corner of Bethway and Litchfield Turnpike, and partake of the temperance drinks. Good, healthy exercise, maybe a little cabaret with the fiddle there. Interestingly enough, if you went out there tomorrow morning at that same spot, you would be surprised at the number of bicycles that travel from New Haven up Litchfield Turnpike for recreational purposes a century later. Technological change in transportation included automobiles. I don't know much about this automobile. I know it was built by George Levi Whitting in front of the old Whitting homestead. The road evidently was paved with leaves in those days. It probably is a steam vehicle. I don't have any more information. I know that Mr. Whitting, who took some of these early pictures, became an auto dealer in Waterbury. One of the reasons that Bethany's landscape looked so different in those days was because of the clearing of trees for various purposes. Obviously for farming purposes, lumbering purposes, firewood. In this case, this is a charcoal pit. And we have a number of different photographs of charcoal pits in a number of different parts of Bethany. As a matter of fact, I walked on the Birmingham Utilities trail just about a week ago, and as we were walking along, the trail happened to go right through a charcoal pit that I don't think anybody had noticed. My son Will looked down and said, "That's charcoal," and sure enough it was. If you look for them, if you're walking in the woods, if you look for them, they're not hard to find. But it resulted in many of the hillsides of Bethany being denuded of trees. Certainly the introduction of portable steam sawmills, which meant you didn't have to bring the logs to the mill, you could bring the mill to the logs, also helped in the clear cutting of areas of Bethany, like this area in the vicinity of Lebanon Swamp. Another change that has had, to this day, an important influence on the appearance of the town is the purchase of properties in Bethany, about over 4,000 acres, by 3 water utilities. This happens to be the Lake Bethany Dam on Hatfield Hill Road at about 1900. This is the earliest photo that we've been able to find of this. Even the Water Authority doesn't have anything this old. The dam was much higher then, simply because later on the road was raised up. A great deal of fill was brought in because the dam was defective and leaked bad. One of the losses, if you're following in our theme of change and preservation, one of the losses that we probably don't feel today because we haven't seen them go were the houses and farms that were either flooded by these water company purchases. This particular one was a very charming house on Litchfield Turnpike, almost across from the present location of the Methodist Cemetery. And there were two old houses there that were torn down by the water company. Today you can find the foundations there. I'm not even sure which one this one is. Again, if you look, this is Litchfield Turnpike, practically an unobstructed view of the lake. Wow, that's pretty dark. But it's just this is a slide that shows the Davidson Telephone Exchange. This was in service in Bethany as a Bethany company until 1907. We could talk to each other even though we were in different homes, in different locations. Big change, something that just didn't exist before. After 1907, of course, Southern New England Telephone Company took over, and now we get calls from people we don't want to hear from. This is the Perkins Tavern. I'm throwing it up here because in the days when there was a big trip to go from Litchfield to New Haven, and you didn't do that in a day. You had to have a tavern, which in this case, or an inn, meant about the same thing. Oh, sure, they had Valentine Ale, but they also had accommodations. This building burned in 1903, so we know this photograph was prior to that. And this particular building was located at the northwest corner of Route 42 in Litchfield Turnpike. I don't know how good you are with directions, but for those of you who are weak on that, we're going to have a little seminar after this talk. Other changes that took place in terms of losses, we're going to be talking about gains and losses. One of the losses was, remember, we didn't need mills as much anymore. This happened to be the Hoadley grist mill. There was also a separate mill for sawing logs and other woodworking. And this stood on Hoadley Road, obviously. And it was taken down in 1903 by the Water Authority, water company, I guess, in those days. I would put that, I guess, categorize that under regrettable losses. Interestingly enough, now that you may notice, by the way, as a cue, I try to give myself a hint that we're going into another decade. So maybe you can be ahead of it, you can figure it out before I can. Bethany Town Hall was built in 1914, brings us to the second decade of the century. And obviously it's going to be a shorter decade because I don't have as many slides. Bethany Town Hall was, we look at it, it's an interesting building and it's been restored and everything, but what does it really mean? Well, it means to me that the citizens of Bethany made an important sacrifice to produce a structure that was one of the largest in Bethany at that time. And certainly, as far as a civic structure, this was amazing. Bethany had never had a city hall, town offices, never before. Now, we have to remember the context in 1914. Farming in general in New England and in Bethany specifically was declining. Many farms in Bethany were empty. People were moving out. Unlike today, people are moving out of the city. If you look in the register today, you'll see that the population of New Haven has decreased. Well, that's what happened to Bethany back in the early part of the century. The lowest population in Bethany was the 1920 census, when we had 411 people, men, women, and children. And yet, we were able to build an important public building at the very time that we had the least resources to do it. Picture of what the town hall looked like in the 1920s. I think we had just gotten electricity in the building. See the bulb? That fixture is still there, but they hadn't taken down the kerosene lamp yet. So it's transitioning. Certainly an important event in the second decade of the 20th century was World War I. And I point out this honor roll, which is presently hanging in its traditional location in the Bethany Historical Society building. It had been taken down, it had been stored away. We recovered it and put it back in its original location. Later on, you're going to see a photograph associated with a bigger war, and you'll see a trace of that particular monument in the photo. On the farm, technology moves apace. I particularly like this one because I like the little engines and stuff. But this is on the Doolittle farm on Downs Road, and here they are cutting cordwood, firewood, the fuel for the winter, with a steam. It's a steam boiler and a steam cylinder. They're running that very dangerous saw. I don't think OSHA would approve using steam power. Also in this period is the very first evidence of the internal combustion engine being used for transportation. This is an early Model T Ford. It's at least before 1916. Early school bus. Russell family was involved in transporting youngsters to school for several decades. This is an early school bus. Those children who were not close enough to the one-room schoolhouses, or at the time when the one-room schoolhouses were to some extent graded, Old Dobbin was able to move them around. This one I've shown before, and it's one of my favorites. This was one that came from Gilbert Whitlock, and it was something his father had taken, I think in 1917, of a stretch of State Highway 69 before improvements. But that is mud. That's when you drove in the road, not on the road. It's pretty amazing, but it shows you how hardy you had to be in the teens, and I think this 1917, it just gives you an idea of what you could expect. Why most people didn't have cars at that time in Bethany. Some cars were here. Our oxen here wouldn't have had so much of a problem. And oxen were used throughout this period. Oxen are very slow. Those of you who have trained them, I guess Monk Woodward has, I believe the rate is 2 miles an hour. A pair of oxen walks at 2 miles an hour. So figure going to New Haven. How long does it take you? Do the math. That's life in the slow lane. This happens to be another Model T being put to agricultural use. I just kind of like this because it shows you how we're taking technology, we're taking something that's really designed for transportation, and we're saying, hey, wait a minute, I can use this for something else. I can use this to get feed for my cows. Not a very big load, but looks like that's one way you could have. Some of these, by the way, are from the Downs collection. Very, very generously allowed us to make slides out of these. They're just great. Model T Fords were the car of Bethany. I at one time looked up the grand list for 1923. There were 60 cars registered in Bethany and that people were paying taxes on. 75% of them were Model T Fords. This is also from Gilbert Whitlock, his father, I remember him. This happens to be my front yard now. My wife's in my front yard. There was a barn there, dairy farm. I just like this one because this is another example of technology changing the town. This is the very first tractor to come to Bethany, and we can look at the grand list and prove it. It says right in there. It's the first tractor. It's a International 816, and it was bought by Gilbert's father, Clifford Whitlock. And I think then the next year, the Myers on the Halter farm bought an 816, and then someone else did. There must have been a dealer around for a very good salesman. Anyway, interesting tractor. Moving along, in case you missed it, we're into the roaring 20s in Bethany. I'm not sure how roaring they were. I don't have any photographs, but I do know that there are pretty well documented that there were illegal facilities for the production of spirituous beverages in Bethany. Stills. By the way, that one was just to show you the, in addition to the date, we were still doing agricultural stuff here as far as fairs. This particular house is just to show you that it's boarded up. Nobody lives there. Nobody wants it. Just sitting there. Many farms were like this. Some houses just collapsed because nobody put a roof on them. More houses, especially in the eastern side of the town, but in all parts of town, in many areas, people, because they could now get out here in cars, especially in the summertime. In the wintertime, a lot of people did not drive cars. The cars were put in the garage or the barn, jacked up, and you waited for warm weather, like people do today with motorcycles, I guess. But a lot of these places were inexpensive, and people with leisure time were able to come up from New Haven, buy these properties, and use them as summer homes. This happened in dozens and dozens of instances. Many times the people that came up here and stayed for the summer, as roads improved and as motor vehicles improved, found that they loved Bethany so much that they just wanted to stay there. In the same way that many people go on vacation, buy vacation homes, and find that they really want to stay there when they're retired or when they're able to. This was located at the corner of Sergeant Drive and Amity Road. I can remember when the fire department burned this at the request of the owner for the purpose of reducing his tax burden. In the 1920s and 30s, I freely admit I have not done the research on this, but the evidence is that this was a prime dairying growth period. This was a time when, instead of the kind of farms we had in the 18th century where they were kind of subsistence farms and you grew a little bit of everything for your own use, you mostly made milk and sold that milk and bought the other things that you needed. And these particular jerseys are, I guess we took that a few years ago, associated with the farm. This is a very typical, what they call American style barn, not like the 18th century barn, the English barn that we still have examples of, but this barn was designed for ease of cleaning. If you want to consider a shovel and wheelbarrow easy, I guess if you've done it many times, it's not too easy. But it was set up for really volume milk production. And we had a lot of these, and a lot of these were built in the late teens and the 20s and even into the 30s. And the milk was sold either wholesale or peddled, as they said. This one, you see the 40-quart milk cans. Nowadays, you mostly see them in antique shops, but that was the way to move milk in those days. This is on the Carrington farm. The previous two photos, I believe, were taken on the early farm. This is, again, this gives you an idea of what's going on in the 1920s with roads. You could easily fit a car into that, I think. That's when you had to put the chains on when there was no snow or ice. And there's a transition taking place here. Roads are improving. This particular watering trough, which is up on Litchfield Turnpike, just south of Ann Drive, and Perkins, just south of Perkins Road also. I show because 1923 was the last year that the town of Bethany paid people to keep these clean and operating. They would be fed by a pipe coming from the spring. So by 1923, they're saying, wait a minute, Old Dobbin is really having it. That's not the main means of transportation anymore. We're not going to subsidize horses. This is Bethany's first garage, repair shop, and car dealership. Elm Shade Garage. This is the big elm tree that provided the names. This building still stands at the corner of Amity Road and Cheshire Road. And I like the hand, it's hard to see in this photograph, but there's a hand crank winch there for the record. I particularly like the price of the gas here. 22 cents a gallon, I wouldn't mind that. That, by the way, that garage was sold Fords, then Plymouths, and then, when I was a youngster, Hudson's. This is an example of somebody coming out from the city in the early 20s, probably, I don't know, 21, 22, something like that. Enjoying the country, and this happens to be on Holy Road, and it also happens to be my father. And at that time he was living in New Haven, and father really just fell in love with Bethany, and the rest, as they say, is history. I don't know much about the car. I think it's a Studebaker, and I'm pretty sure that has more than 4 cylinders under that hood. Bethany Airport. We're still in the 20s, remember, and Bethany Airport is one of the earliest airports in Connecticut, and by that, also in New England. This is taken later than the 20s, but I think it gives you a pretty good idea of what the vegetation was like and what the field looked like. Many people don't realize how the field worked, and this is the main runway, north and south. This is Amity Road here, right away. This is Fairwood Road, just to orient you. This area here is where the old hangars are. Presently, the town garage is in about that area. In this area here, I know a lot of people are worried we're cutting down the virgin forest. Obviously, it hasn't been virgin forest very long. One of the, are you getting it? Okay, good. It took me a minute too. The third decade of the 20th century, we certainly, besides an excellent segue, this just gives you an idea of something that was very important to the people. See that the concept, again, of preservation, traditional values, in this case, the centennial. The town was organized and incorporated in 1832, and this is a centennial celebration. Also in the 1930s, and here again, my interpretation, you can disagree with me, just do it some other night. The 30s were, as we know in the United States, those of you who lived through it, or those of you who don't know about it, were certainly characterized by Great Depression. And in Bethany, a lot of progress was made during this period. I'm not sure just why. I think in Maine they say, well, they weren't hurt too bad by the Great Depression because it came on the heels of hard times. Well, maybe that was true in Bethany, and not so many people noticed it. Certainly people who had farms didn't go hungry. We didn't have, the kind of desperate conditions that existed in the cities. Not that people were necessarily wealthy. Some of the accomplishments of this decade, of the 30s, was the establishment of a free public library in Bethany in 1930. This was on the grounds of the property of Treat B. Johnson. That little building still stands and is now a residence. This is next to the house presently occupied by John and Jean Culver. Certainly changing the face of Bethany, and as a response to changing technology, was the improvement to Amity Road. Maybe some of us wish that hadn't happened. Right now, I wish people went a little slower in this area. But you can see that what we're doing here is we're taking down the hill. It's hard to believe that hill is higher than it was. This is going north on Amity Road with the Congregational Church on this side. The Child's House, that big white house next to the Historical Society, is on the right. And when you drive by there, you'll notice there's a rock cut. Well, originally the road would have gone over the rock cut, over the top of where the rock cut was made. Great shot. Real steam engine, real smoke and steam. Powered by coal. You'll notice that we know that this is about 1932, because that's when this project took place. And we know it's before 1938, because we still have a steeple on the Congregational Church. Not only was the state roads being improved, but the town of Bethany was improving its roads, even before World War II. Most of the widening and paving, notice I'm not saying improving, of roads in Bethany took place after the war. But here you can see in 1937, that just happens to be a photograph we took of the old Bear Hill Bridge before it was replaced a couple of years ago. It's the only bridge in town that had a date on it. I've kind of requested that the selectmen make sure that from now on, all bridges in town have dates on them. And this has happened. Very important change in the educational system in Bethany in the 1930s was a change from one-room schoolhouses to a consolidated community school. We did have a lot more pupils, by the way. We went from 4 or 5 one-room schoolhouses to 1 4-room schoolhouse, still with 8 grades. This happens to be the dedication ceremony of the main building, which is now the town hall, in 1934. At that time, this is such a nice story, we'll go through it. You remember the old center schoolhouse was converted into a firehouse. The doors were put up in order for Red Cunningham to have a target to hit when he drove the fire engine out of the building. And sometimes he didn't miss. You can see we're moving right up as far as modern conveyances for taking our children to school. That one happened in 1932. Probably the date of the vehicle is somewhere in the late 20s. Is that an international? What do you think? Yeah. I bet it is. One of the interesting things that happened in the 1930s and late 1930s was this experiment in cooperative living. I don't know if that's exactly the right term, which was associated with Bethany's very first subdivision, Bethany Wood. And this is really the only pre-war subdivision that we had. All the subdivisions, the planned subdivisions that Bethany has had, really date from after World War II. except for this one. This garage still stands, and it was used communally. If you go by there today, I think they still have 1, 2, 3, 4 in the doors, so that, various people living there would be assigned garages, because it was and is a private road, not plowed by the town, and in inclement weather, it was nice to be able to have only a short distance to dig out to get to Bethany Road. 1938 is the year of the hurricane. Lots of damage to structures in Bethany. Primarily, Congregational Church lost this element, and it wasn't until a couple of years ago that it was replaced, because you don't want to act too fast. You don't want to be hasty. With my experience, probably it took that long for the insurance company to settle. This is a picture you don't very often see, the Congregational Church shed. The one that we're familiar with is the one across from the Episcopal Church that was used by them, but there was also a Congregational Church shed, and yes, there was one for the Methodist Church as well. Notice the hillside back of it. Except for an occasional tree left to provide shade for the cattle, absolutely bare. Incidentally, that's about where the proposed K through 2 elementary school would be located. And now on the darker side, those of you not familiar with this structure, you may have read about this in the paper, maybe a couple of months ago. It happened that Herb Howard found among some of the papers on his property an article about the Wicked Inn. That's in this picture, you can't read it, it says the Litchfield Grill, and it also serves spirits, and also had some unsavory associations with certain ethnic associations, and it had a evidently well-deserved reputation as a house of ill repute. And there's only one person here tonight that admits to having set foot in it. But Arnold, don't worry, I'm not going to tell you. Very innocent. He was a young boy delivering papers, and he did it once. And he didn't inhale.
Where was it located?
This was good question. This was located at. Are you good at directions? You're pretty good. Okay. This was located at the southwest corner of the intersection of Litchfield Turnpike and Route 42. How many have that? Not too good. Wow.
That was near that garage.
No, it's a little further south. If you're going west on Route 42 from the old part of Litchfield Turnpike toward Lakeview Lodge or Beacon Falls or whatever, it would be on that corner. And the Perkins Tavern was on the north side of that corner, and this was built years later at the south side. And I believe, according to our informant, this burned in 1939. Right, Arnold? I don't know why he knows so much about it.
34.
What's that?
34.
34?
Yeah, because that's when they started the fire department.
We hope that wasn't the reason why the fire department started. Thank you very much. Good. That's good. That's good help. In 1939, we have an important addition to town, the building of a state police barracks. The state police barracks has provided protection to Bethany at virtually no cost to the Bethany taxpayers for, 60 years? Yeah. This is, many people don't realize, if you drive by it, this is a tremendous boon to our community because it has prevented us from having to establish a very costly police department, such as we might find in the neighbor town to the south. We're getting up in time, Certainly, we have to mention World War II. Many people in this room were involved in that great war. And the post-war plans was, I'll go back here. This post-war planning pamphlet is the earliest published piece of work that I have seen concerning town planning in Bethany. And it's kind of interesting. You know, that's over 50 years ago. Bethany Athletic Association was formed, I believe, in 1940, 41, something like that. Right in the early part of the decade. We're into the 40s, by the way, if you haven't noticed it. I don't know if you missed the date at the bottom. I gave you the hint, but I didn't give you the cue on it. This is the remains of the hangar of the old Bethany Airport that burned in 1942. Shows you what happens to steel when it's heated. Fire. How did the war affect Bethany? Probably mostly with, like the rest of the country, shortages of gasoline, rubber, soap, sugar, all that kind of stuff. And certainly the fact that many Bethany people served in the war. This is kind of interesting. This little barn that formerly stood on Hatfield Hill Road across from the Lake Bethany Dam had a room sort of finished off in it for a watchman because they were very worried during World War II about sabotage of drinking water supplies. This is Ellie Downs, old Ellie Downs. And he looks like he's well armed. This is the dam in back. This is right across from that little barn. So yeah, we were concerned. I mean, World War II hit us, even though we weren't invaded. It really struck us. 3 of our citizens gave their lives in this war. This is a listing of the veterans. Some people in this room were listed on this very first honor roll. This was made out of wood and did not last very long. But when it was erected, it was a very handsome thing. This is a photograph of what was done for the veterans. Veterans were invited to a reception and a dinner. The dinner was held downstairs in the old town hall. This was to honor the veterans after the end of the war. And what I like about this is shows the old town hall heavily decorated, but just in the background of this recognition of the World War II veterans, you can just see the phantom outline of the World War I memorial. You can see we're really getting up into modern times. This is a school bus I rode on. It's 1938, and I know this is international. And for those of you who remember, John Whitlock purchased this from Mr. Russell. And at this time it was a kind of a forest green, kind of unusual for a school bus these days. You notice the children, why do the children have their backs to the windows? That's because there were benches. There was a single bench that went the entire length of both sides. In the center there were conventional seats, but on the edges there were just benches, and when the driver braked suddenly, most of the children ended up somewhere near the front of the bus. This is an example of some early commercial development after the Second World War, in the very late 40s. I think Walt Walensky built this in 1949, something like that. You'll notice that in addition to Pegasus here, there's this fairly discernible symbol for Ford. It's a Ford dealer at that time. Hard to believe we've had 2 Ford dealers in that day. Right after the war, the baby boom happened. Starting in 1949, the first 2 rooms were added on to the school, followed by this facility that we're in right now, 1952. completed, probably dedicated in 1953. Picking up on this, are you? Okay, just want to make sure you're with the program. This began a period of unprecedented school classroom expansion. And many people in Bethany do not understand how this has worked, where we've come from, how we got to where we are. Remember, we had 4 classrooms for 8 grades, starting back maybe during most of the 19th century and up until 1934. Certainly for about 100 years, we had about the same capacity. Okay, suddenly after World War II, things went crazy. We went from 4 classrooms in about 1950 to 34 classrooms in 1970. That's in 30 years. Okay, you don't change the size of the school in 100 years. Then you jump like that in 30 years. We're going to see later on that we next have 25 years with no growth at all. As a matter of fact, the school populations drop and 8 classrooms that had previously been in this building are abandoned by the Board of Education. By the way, there will be no projections about future schools tonight. Getting back to regrettable losses, certainly this classic Greek Revival Methodist Church on Litchfield Turnpike in front of, this is the Methodist Cemetery. Most of you, I hope, know where that is. It's on the west side of Litchfield Turnpike. All that's left here are 2 concrete steps. The rest of the building is gone. It was torn down in 1955, and the lumber was going to be used to build a clubhouse for the veterans of foreign wars. This never got built, and the wood just rotted just over the line in Beacon Falls on Route 42. Last time I was there a few years ago, I took a photograph, and there was 1 beam still there that had been out in the rain since 1955. This is chestnut wood. Any of you know about chestnut? It's a very long-lasting wood, and this is one example. A regrettable loss, certainly. Zoning was a major issue, and we could spend a lot of time on that. Keep Bethany free. This is when the Iron Curtain was invading us. This is when the communists came in. I think we had a communist zoning enforcement officer in those days. Was that you, Mr. Von Baron? Just keep Bethany free from the Iron Curtain. So that says communism to me. At any rate, this is 1949. Zoning had a hard time getting passed. Finally, virtually the form we have today was adopted in 1952. Something else in sort of cultural, in my opinion, is the newspaper that was printed between 1950 and 1953 by George Vail, who was, in my opinion, just a remarkable person. Very well written paper. We have copies of them. Sometime I would like to see someone in this room tonight do a talk on this. We have all the materials. Just a fascinating period of time where we had a paper right here devoted to Bethany. Also in 1950, new firehouse, Center Station. Another accomplishment of this decade is the addition onto the Old Town Hall, 1952, which meant that we now had things like running water in the Town Hall, a vault to keep the records in. Also in the 1950s was the construction of the existing hangar at the airport. The Bethany Airport was very active in the 1950s, and it's evidenced by the fact that that a new structure was being built. And we have a couple of these. This is kind of interesting to see how they did it. Probably needs a little work today. On the water company front, this just happens to be Lake Chamberlain. This was a major improvement in a piece of land that we value as open space today. But Lake Chamberlain was a lake of 40-foot depth, which is a pretty good-sized lake. And 1959, I believe, it was increased to 80 feet, more than doubling the capacity. I just like this one. This one was taken in 1957, and it just shows the two means of transportation. The planes at the airport there, and of course the Chevy wagon speeding along Litchfield Turnpike. This today is Teddy B's. This is how it started, just a little ice cream drive-in. This is how did we get to where we are? Well, we're getting there. I'm not sure whether this is a regrettable loss or not. I think so. Probably not everybody thinks so. This is, by the way, you're going to have really good eyes to get this key. We're moving into the 1960s. This was the last court here at the Bethany Town Court before it got taken over by the state. There might be some familiar people here. Obviously, my father on the right. Judge Hinman. Clerk of the court, George Dale. John Edmondson, Les Hopkins, and we have this gentleman, we don't know what his name is. Yeah, I guess Ernie Sachs. Okay, more planning. This is a time that we began thinking about, gee, let's increase our tax base, let's create an industrial park, let's buy up the airport. Well, we did part of it. What happened, though, in the intervening years, because Bethany really wasn't that attractive to major industries, although we sold off a few pieces of property, most of it has been held by the town, and gradually, through no other use, I guess, gradually has become a recreational area that's used by many people, many groups. You don't go by there practically a day in good weather when you don't see kids playing soccer there. Just absolutely amazing, as well as other municipal uses. It has become Bethany's Central Park. Also in the 60s, 1963, I believe, Bethany got another school. This time, a building owned by the Region 5, and this is of course, the junior high school on Blue Hill Road. And this was the great fire at the there was no fire at this school. This actually was taken by George Jackson, who, by the way, donated a lot of these slides to us. Slides without which we really wouldn't be able to show some of the stuff. But to give you a balanced picture of what things were like, this fire is not even in Bethany, it's in Beacon Falls, and it's at the dump. And this went on steadily, day after day. Materials were dumped at the Beacon Heights landfill and burned. Rubbish, garbage, chemicals, everything. And it's just a great juxtaposition. I had to use it. But it's warts and all. These were the conditions that we had in the early 1960s. Fortunately, Bethany never had a dump of its own. We never had a landfill in Bethany. One of the very fortunate towns. Even though our town plan highly recommended that we establish a dump, we didn't pay any attention to the town plan. Probably very fortunate. Just thought I'd kind of show you how things have changed in Bethany. We're in the 60s now, and this is the center of Bethany with the two churches still there. But the churches have gotten swallowed up by trees. Very little is left. There is a farm left here that's about to be developed. This is the Hoadley House down here. Amity Road, Falls Road, and probably, it's hard to tell, probably Long Island Sound's out there somewhere. Hard to tell, but it's become a town of trees instead of a town of fields. Town of snow in this case. I just wanted to throw this in here to show you another shot of the Lake Bethany Dam at Hoadley Road. And Hatfield Hill Road, I'll get it. Must be time to quit, huh? Steve Collins gave me this photo, just showing that as late as the 1960s, lumber was being harvested with horses. This is on Brooks Road. This certainly isn't the first time that people have appreciated the beauties of Bethany. Remember Bethany and its hills, remember people biking, remember people coming out to visit for joyrides, establishing summer homes. This is a beautiful spot even today. This is that huge glacial erratic found in the Naugatuck State Forest. It's Peak of Cap. And when I was that age, I was able to climb it too. During this decade, there began to be more interest in preservation. Not that there wasn't any before. I think, at least I hope you've gotten that idea. And at this time, the Bethany Land Trust was incorporated and began its work of preserving land. Not this particular preserve, this Speakman Preserve is fairly recent. It's a very large 110-acre parcel in the eastern part of Bethany that has an easement on it to protect it from development in perpetuity. Okay, if you missed this one by now, it's all over. 1970, remember I mentioned that's the year that we reached our greatest number of classrooms until the last project. Also, in the 1970s came an important date, the bicentennial, and a very dedicated group of people who were interested in preservation took it upon themselves to take this rundown center schoolhouse, which had been moved up to Munson Road, back down Amity Road, located, it's white up there, checking on the wires, to its present location where it's been restored. And it's really, at least to me, the centerpiece of the school complex up there. I mean, it's really a focal point. Also during this decade, Bethany got its second firehouse, the Hinman Station on Bear Hill and Hinman Roads. Still have our 1950 fire engine. Again, during this decade, we have move of the town hall from its location on Amity Road to this building. I don't think we have to say much more about that. In conjunction with this, this happens to be the Hoadley House, our first and only National Register property in Bethany was established. That happens to be what it looked like almost exactly 100 years ago. Fewer trucks in this place. In addition, was added to Hinman Station. Again, these are little improvements that are building, that they're kind of getting us to where we are today. Another event, sesquicentennial, very important to people in Bethany. This was a big event. It involved large portions of the community, fundraising, selling souvenirs like this. It resulted in the establishment of our town seal that we still use. Really a great celebration, a great outpouring of civic pride. I kind of like this. This is a float that was entered by the Cloverman Farm, and It's actually recycled flow. They had already used it in 1932, but I think it's a wonderful tribute to tradition and preservation. Also at this time, this happens to be, in case, I'm going to stay on here. I don't know if you can read it, and I'll stay on here for a couple of minutes, but if you haven't seen this, we got this handsome sign from the state. They had some extra bucks or something, I don't know. And they offered these to towns free, and we got ours. And they're very interesting. If you go to little towns in Connecticut, you don't know much about them, go to the town hall, and chances are you're going to find one of these plaques out in front somewhere, and it's going to tell you something about the history of the town. This one, you notice, I can't. It says "see other side," and there's more text. The towns that are not very creative put the same thing on both sides. You know, they're to be pitied. But Bethany had Bethany's was contained about all the history you could fit on a piece of metal that big. And my recollection is that this was written by Alice Bunton. If somebody wants to correct me, feel free to, but I believe she wrote that. And I think it's certainly fitting that we show that tonight. Our first and only shopping center, unless we get a Walmart or something like that, still isn't full. Back to the airport. The airport continues to be used for a wide variety of recreational uses. I kind of said to myself that I wasn't going to show any people in here, but you know, I don't have that much strength of character, so I think we had to say something about Gordon Carrington. He's our last. He was and probably will be our last farmer for selectmen. He certainly was someone that pitched in. Here he is, helping to load the table from the old town hall to here. I mean, you can't talk. You can't pitch in much more than that. And the memorial to Gordon, who died in office during this decade. Also, now that we're up to the 80s, the New Haven Water Company became the South Central Regional Water Authority, and it changed its focus a little bit. It became a little more user-friendly. They were able to open up trails at several locations in Bethany for the public on a permanent basis. We're up to our latest edition that was favorably received at the referendum, that is, up here at the community school. So I guess we're getting ahead. It must be up to the 90s. For the last decade, but this can be the longest. So I'm going to move a little faster with this. You probably saw this taking place. Actually turned out to be a pretty handsome building. One of the accomplishments of the 90s, the early 90s, was the building of the new town garage and a very, very efficient and attractive-looking recycling center, if a recycling center can be attractive. I've seen other towns, and we do a lot of fleet of trucks in front of the building. In my opinion, one of the great advantages, or one of the great accomplishments, rather, of the 90s was the acquisition of the old Bethany West property, now Veterans Memorial Park. Here they're in the process of removing material in order to lower the field to make a level, well-drained soccer field. To me, this is kind of the preservation end of it. The clubhouse, now Lakeview Lodge, doesn't look like that today. It looks a little better. If those of you who haven't been there, please take a look at it. This is the Salzier phase. You have to go there to see the silver phase. This is just at the very beginning when a foundation is being prepared for the addition of a new lobby. What we're showing here is the temporary location of the Bethany Library during the period of expansion. The library put on $1 million addition, largely with the help of state and federal grants, as well as generous donations from a large proportion of people in town. I can't remember what the percentage was, but it was tremendous participation. We built $1 million building and it cost the town taxpayers $130,000. That's getting the biggest bang for the buck. But during the several years that the library was being renovated, we were able to secure this small space in back of the shopping center, but it's kind of cramped, but actually very usable library area. Interestingly enough, during this period, our circulation increased. And this is our final library, just a magnificent asset to the community. I've heard a lot of compliments about the appearance of this building. In no way does it compromise the classic building that was built in 1936. Of course, this is a historical society meeting, so we have to acknowledge that the Historical Society was active during the 90s. It was formed. The generous donation of the property and the participation of the town made possible the acquisition of this building and subsequent restoration. This is the original committee here when I guess this must have been when we were either just bought it or were about to buy it, or we bought the fire department. Terrible picture. Took off the asbestos siding and found that, surprisingly enough, the shingles underneath were in generally very good condition. We expected to have to replace all the siding and didn't have to. This is what it looks like painted, completely restored inside and out. And a flag restored to the roof. Another photograph, kind of tried to blend in that 1952 edition as far as color, roof line. This is shows the extent to which the original courtroom, selectmen's meeting room was restored, very much like it looked in 1914. Another preservation initiative during this period was the very successful restoration project of the church shed. This is, as you know, one of the 3 church sheds that existed in Bethany in the early part of the century. Church sheds existed at virtually every church in Connecticut's 169 towns. Yet, this is the only church shed left in the state of Connecticut in its original location. And just a tremendous job. We had donations of labor, we had donations of money from townspeople. Again, tremendous participation, showing the interest that Bethany people have in preservation. There it is, kind of jacked up. It's almost floating because over the years it has sunk down due to bad drainage. And here it is restored. It's just a marvelous job. It's good for, well, it's about 150 years old, and it's probably good for another 150 years. Another little restoration. Remember, we mentioned earlier, probably this is shortly after the insurance company settled the 1938 claim. Boy, don't I sound cynical. And there's good reason. That's just such a great shot. You know, all these are kind of landmarks in this section. It kind of brought us back to what it looked like before. This is the center of town. This is the basis of our town seal. When we think of Bethany, we think of that. Now we're going to go back to regrettable losses. This is the old barn on the Hinman property on Amity Road, just north of the firehouse. This was home to John Hinman's printing shop downstairs, and up here was the town clerk's office for many, many years. The house, the old Hinman house, was, I guess, just kind of beyond repair at this point, and this is the third plate that was taken out of it, and it didn't take long to come down. Plenty of regrettable losses when you think about it. I mean, here's a first, I guess you can see the silo is kind of leaning and is not long for this world. This barn was torn down, and subsequently that barn. All of that is gone. It was the home of a dairy farm for many, many years. Regrettable loss. I know I said I had tried not to put any people in here, but I couldn't resist. In the regrettable loss category, Alice Wood. But we still have some stuff. We still have dirt roads. This happens to be the very first scenic road that was designated in Bethany. This section of Carrington Road is unpaved. Bethany Land Trust has been very active in preservation. This is just one of the many parcels that have been donated to the trust in the last 10 years. Tremendous interest in preserving land, tremendous interest in preserving the past, tremendous interest in preserving traditional values. Clovernook Farm. Again, this is, to me, a very, very important preservation initiative. As you know, the referendum, town meeting, let's not talk referendum. The town meeting voted to funds for an agricultural conservation easement to protect this part of the farm. 18 acres of land, including this old handsome old horse barn. Very picturesque. Here's a piece of property and a building that are still producing valuable commodities for townspeople. Passed unanimously. Okay, we're getting toward the end. In fact, I think this is the end. We have Scotty here. Yeah, could you catch those lights for me? I just had to close with this because it's the right time of year. This beautiful scene taken on Carmel Road, Madbury Mountain in the background. Just to kind of bring you up with another scene of why people love Bethany, why we're interested in preservation. I think that's it. Oh, questions, or somebody want 5 minutes for rebuttal?
One of the big paradoxes of this whole thing is he asks you to give one of his speeches, and then he shows up and does something like this. Thank you all for coming. I'm sure he touched on a lot of people that have done a lot of things in town. So our Slicer's smiling back there. Mr. Whitlock smiling up here. Red Cunningham. Clovernook Farm. Touched a lot of bases tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.